Hi everyone. I wanted to share a story that my relative told me, something that happened to a friend of hers. It's been haunting me ever since I heard it, and I thought those of you who love scary, horrifying tales might appreciate it. I'm getting chills just typing this out, so I hope you're ready. Before I begin, please note that all the names mentioned have been changed. Here we go. My relative's friend, a woman named Lisa, is an avid hiker. She and her husband, Tom, have always been passionate about exploring the wilderness. They've been on countless hikes, often with a small group of close friends who share their love for nature. But nothing could have prepared them for what they experienced on their last trip. It was winter, and the idea of hiking through snow-covered woods had always appealed to them. No bugs, no snakes, no bears, just the pristine, silent beauty of a frozen forest. Tom was especially excited because he could hunt during the trip, bringing along fresh meat to cook over the campfire. They invited their friends, Mike, Sarah, and Jess, who were all eager to join. The group set up camp deep in the woods, far from any towns or trails. The snow was untouched, the air was crisp, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. It was the perfect setting for a winter adventure. But Lisa told my relative that from the moment they arrived, she had a strange feeling like they were being watched. She brushed it off as nerves. After all, the isolation of the forest can play tricks on your mind. The first day after setting up camp, the group decided to go on a long hike to explore the surrounding area. But Lisa wasn't feeling well. She said it was as if something heavy was pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She decided to stay behind while the others went ahead, promising to rest and rejoin them later. The others left, and Lisa spent the day alone at the campsite, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her. As the day wore on, she couldn't help but notice how quiet the forest was. It wasn't just the usual silence of winter. This was deeper, more oppressive, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. When night fell and the group hadn't returned, Lisa began to worry. They were experienced hikers, and while it wasn't unusual for them to stay out late, something didn't feel right. The hours dragged on, and the darkness outside the tent grew thicker, more suffocating. She tried to call them, but there was no signal. It felt like the forest was swallowing up everything, the light, the sound, even the air. The next day they still hadn't returned. Lisa was starting to panic. She could barely sleep, constantly jolted awake by the smallest noise. At one point she thought she heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside her tent, but when she peeked out there was nothing there, just the empty, cold woods. By the third day, Lisa was beside herself with fear. She didn't know what to do. Should she try to find them or stay at the camp in case they came back? The cold was getting worse, the snow falling heavier, and she knew she couldn't survive much longer alone in those conditions. Then late in the afternoon she heard voices. Relief flooded through her as she saw Mike, Sarah, and Jess approaching the camp. But her relief quickly turned to dread when she realized Tom wasn't with them. They looked exhausted, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with something she couldn't quite place. Fear maybe, or shock. Mike was the one who broke the news. He told Lisa that during the hike, Tom had slipped and fallen off a cliff into a deep ravine. They tried to reach him, but it was impossible. The drop was too steep, the terrain too dangerous. He was gone. Lisa said it was like her world collapsed. The others tried to comfort her, but they were too exhausted to do much. They looked like they hadn't slept in days, their clothes torn and dirty, their eyes hollow. Something about them seemed off, like they were just shadows of themselves, drained of life. She retreated to her tent, needing to be alone to process the shock. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. She kept replaying their words in her mind, trying to make sense of them, but they felt flat, lifeless, like they weren't telling her everything, like there was some terrible truth they were hiding. As night fell, Lisa lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the tent's ceiling, her mind racing. The wind howled outside, rattling the tent, and she felt more alone than she ever had in her life. She couldn't stop thinking about Tom, about him lying somewhere in the snow, cold and alone, and it tore her apart. Then, sometime in the dead of night, she heard it, the sound of someone unzipping the tent. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The others should have been asleep by now, and there was no reason for anyone to be opening her tent. She could hear the wind outside, but it wasn't enough to drown out the slow, deliberate sound of the zipper being pulled open. She turned her head, barely able to breathe, and saw a figure standing at the entrance of the tent. At first, she thought it was one of the others, but as the figure stepped inside, she saw his face, Tom. But something was horribly wrong. His clothes were torn and dirty, his skin pale and bloodied, and his eyes were wild, almost feral. Lisa's first instinct was to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. The others had said he was dead, that he'd fallen to his death. But here he was, standing right in front of her, alive. "Tom?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't respond right away. His breathing was heavy, labored, and he looked like he'd been through hell. But then she noticed something. He was wearing the necklace she'd given him, the one his father had passed down to him. It was the one thing he never took off, no matter what. Seeing it convinced her that this was really him. She threw her arms around him, sobbing, feeling the warmth of his body, the solidity of him. It was Tom, her Tom, and he was alive. But even as she held him, she could feel something was wrong. His body was cold, too cold, and he trembled violently as if he'd been out in the snow for far too long. "We have to go," Tom said suddenly, pulling back from her embrace. His voice was rough, almost a growl. "We have to leave now." "What? What happened?" "They told me you were." "Lisa, we don't have time," he interrupted, his eyes darting around the tent. "They're not coming back. We need to leave now." Fear gnawed at her insides. She could see the panic in his eyes, the urgency in his voice. Without questioning him further, she began to pack her things, her hands trembling as she stuffed her gear into her bag. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she had to trust him. As they stepped out of the tent, the cold night air hit her like a slap. The camp was eerily silent, the other tents dark and still. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The others should have been awake, should have been keeping watch, but the camp was as quiet as a graveyard. "Where are the others?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom didn't answer. He just grabbed her hand and started leading her away from the camp, his grip tight and unyielding. They moved quickly through the trees, the snow crunching beneath their boots. Lisa kept looking back, expecting to see the others following, but there was nothing. Just the black void of the forest swallowing up the camp. As they walked, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees, once tall and majestic, now loomed over them like twisted, skeletal hands reaching out of the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their labored breathing and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. After what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing. Tom finally stopped, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He looked around, his eyes wild, as if expecting something to jump out of the shadows. "We're not safe here," he muttered, more to himself than to Lisa. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tom turned to her, his face pale and strained. "They're gone, Lisa. Mike, Sarah, Jess, they didn't make it. I was the only one who got out." Lisa felt like the ground was falling away beneath her. "But I saw them. They were at the camp. They told me you were." "I don't know what you saw," Tom said, shaking his head, "but it wasn't them. It couldn't have been." She stared at him, her mind reeling. His words didn't make any sense. How could they have been there if they were gone? What had she seen? What had she spoken to? "We have to keep moving," Tom said, his voice urgent. "We can't stay here. It's not safe." Lisa nodded, too scared to argue, too confused to ask any more questions. They started moving again, faster this time, pushing through the snow-covered forest. But as they went, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was following them just out of sight. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified, echoing through the trees like a warning. The fear was so intense, so palpable, that it felt like a living thing wrapping itself around her, squeezing the breath out of her lungs. Then, just as they were nearing the edge of the forest, Lisa saw them. 3 figures standing at the tree line, their bodies rigid, their faces obscured by the darkness. For a moment she thought it was Mike, Sarah, and Jess, but then she realized there was something wrong with them. Their movements were too stiff, too unnatural, and their eyes were empty, hollow, like black pits staring into nothing. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed Tom's arm, trying to pull him away, but he was already moving, dragging her with him into the cover of the trees. "We can't go that way," he hissed, his voice filled with a fear she had never heard before. "Why not? The lights, there's a town." "No." Tom's voice was sharp, almost frantic. "We have to find another way." Lisa didn't understand, but the terror in his voice was enough to make her follow without question. They veered off the path, moving parallel to the tree line, keeping their distance from the figures. Lisa kept glancing back, expecting them to follow, but they remained still, their empty eyes watching, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, they found another trail leading out of the forest. This time there were no figures, no shadowy shapes waiting for them. They hurried down the path, their steps quick and frantic, until finally they emerged into a small village. The sight of houses, of lights, of life, felt surreal after everything they had been through. They found a small inn and checked in without saying much to the woman at the front desk. Lisa was too shaken, too exhausted to think about anything other than getting to the safety of their room. Once inside, Tom locked the door, pulling the curtains shut before collapsing onto the bed. Lisa wanted to ask him what had happened, what they had seen, but she was too tired to form coherent thoughts. She lay down next to him, her body trembling with cold and fear, and despite everything, she eventually drifted off to sleep. But even now, weeks later, Lisa can't shake the feeling that they didn't truly escape. That something is still out there in those woods, watching, waiting. She doesn't know what it was or why it let them go, but she can't help but feel like they're not truly safe even now. And as I share this story with you, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if they had gone toward those lights? If they had faced whatever those figures were? I guess we'll never know. But one thing is for sure, Lisa's never going back to those woods. And after hearing this, I don't think I ever will either. I hope you're all staying safe out there, especially those who love the wilderness as much as Lisa and Tom once did. You never know what's lurking in the dark, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Stay safe and sleep with the lights on. If you enjoyed this story, hit like and subscribe to Horror Confession to get notified about our latest chilling tales. Thanks for watching.